I'm wrong. I'm pretty certain Hezbollah would not have come into being, certainly with any influence whatsoever, had Israel not have invaded the Lebanon in 1982 and then occupied the south for another 20 years.
Well, I think I think that the shape of Shi'i mobilization in Lebanon would have been very different. But I think that the mobilization actually predated the invasions.
Right.
By quite a long way, in the sense that they really took place at the end of the 60s and the 70s and had to do with social trends that were taking place within the Shi'i community at that time. There was a sense of alienation with the feudal system. There was a change in their economic circumstances that promoted a mobilization. But what actually gave it substantive form, I believe, was actually their transfer to the suburbs of Beirut that actually created a real coherent mobilization. And that, of course, was provoked ultimately by the Sharon's occupation of the south.
Oh.
But some of the seeds of it preceded, I believe, that.
Right. So what we're saying is that Israeli policy as regards Hamas, as regards Hezbollah, has been counterproductive. Could we not go one stage further? Could we not say that President Bush and Prime Minister Blair were the best recruiting sergeants for violent Islamic fundamentalism?
Well, I think what you say is really very interesting and very true, because actually, I mean, what happened in Lebanon, and it's particularly relevant today when we look at Gaza, but when Israel first arrived in South Lebanon in '82, they were actually quite well received by the Shi'i, who were getting a little fed up by some of the rather obnoxious members of the PLO who were in the area at the time. And the Israelis were not badly received. It was only after the occasion when an Israeli column drove through an Ashura ceremony that the beginnings of a localized resistance took place. And it was localized. The imams of the mosque and others were behind it. But what was the Israeli reaction? What they did, and here again Gaza is the model, they cut off the south of Lebanon from the rest of the country. They allowed only the goods to pass through one small checkpoint. The economy nearly collapsed in the south because it was dependent on the export of fruit and vegetables to the center in Beirut. And they started persuading the people to give up their leadership, to abandon the leadership, and to bypass the leadership by these economic pressures. Well, what happened, of course, was that they did bypass the leadership, the local tribal leaders. But they bypassed them first for a mile, and then Israel responded by assassinations and tougher measures in the area, tougher economic measures. And again, that leadership, too, was bypassed. But it was bypassed this time by Hezbollah. So in an end, what you say is exactly right. The tactics were counterproductive, and we see exactly the same history taking place in Gaza, where an economic siege has been imposed on it with the idea of persuading the population to bypass the Hamas leadership. What has happened? It has actually strengthened the Hamas leadership.
So can we say that to the extent that there is perceived in the West an Islamic monster, can we say, you and I as two Western gentlemen sitting here saying, okay, there's a monster, but actually we created it?
I think there are two elements to this that I think, and it's important to distinguish it. I think that the rise of Islamism, mainstream Islamist movements, was probably inevitable because of the social and political circumstances in the region. What I think we have created is a far greater security risk. In fact, it is the cause of the security risk by the adoption of the so-called war on terror, which actually conflated mainstream Islamist movements that were predominantly concerned with the social and spiritual well-being of people, and conflated these with the groups that we associate with Al-Qaeda, and claimed that they were all the same. These were Islamic extremists. But there was this huge difference, because essentially what was the the aim of the Islamist movements was to try and reform society incrementally and gradually. And of course, after this process, the Al-Qaeda, the Salafi groups turned to the movements like Hamas and Hezbollah, and they said, you'll never succeed. The West will never, ever allow you to make reforms for your society or to gain power, and therefore the only thing that there is left to do is to burn it down, burn down the remaining colonial structure, burn down society, and out of the ashes will come a truly just society. And of course, by pushing the moderates into the same bracket, more and more young people have been convinced, there is no point. They look at what's happened to Hamas in Gaza. They look what's happening in Egypt. They see what is happening to moderates everywhere. And they say, well, they were right. There is no alternative. We must burn the system down. So what we've created is the momentum, the sense that there's no point. There's no point in politics. There's no point in elections. The only thing we can do with the West is ultimately to create the circumstances in which we burn down the system and then start again.
Is not another factor that has contributed to this momentum in the Arab and Muslim regimes, in that they could be perceived by angry, humiliated Arabs and other Muslims as not having done anything to check the arrogance of the West and of Israel? They've actually been more the collaborators of it. Is that a factor in strengthening the fundamentalism?
It's been much more than that. I believe you can say it's been a real multiplier of this effect, because what has happened is, in a sense, the war on terror has actually not only given the green light, but encouraged many of these regimes to resort not simply to imprisonment, but some of the worst aspects of brutality and torture that, of course, are continuing to radicalize their people. It also, the language of the war on terror, actually cut off these Arab regimes from any ability to try and find some sort of accommodation with the radicalism that was growing in their own societies and the demand for change, because simply the war on terror language mechanically prevented them from talking to the people or engaging with the people that they wanted to if they wished to remain friends with Washington. So in a sense, it gave a huge multiplier effect by isolating further Western friends in the region, but leaving them with almost no option but repression as the answer to Hamas winning the elections, to the rise of Islamist sentiment, mainstream Islamist sentiment, not Al-Qaeda, mainstream reformist sentiment. Their only answer to that then was left to them by the West was repression. And that has left us now with a situation of a hugely unstable region. There's a region that now is so vulnerable that if a single incident, a bad incident, could be the one spark that could unleash dynamics that could bring really huge changes. It's unstable and highly tense as a consequence of these policies.
I describe the Palestine problem as the cancer at the heart of international affairs. And I say that if an American president really used the leverage he has